Which hero lived long enough to turn into a villain? Story 1. It's definitely Rudy Giuliani. You have to actively be trying to mess up a legacy as a 9/11 hero. People also forget he led the prosecutor who brought down the mob in New York City in the 80s. Many people think the Italian mafia was prosecuted in order to clear the way for the Russian mob to rise in New York City. I don't know if that's true. Rudy does have some ties to Russian criminals, but a lot of people in New York City do. But I will point out to dozens and dozens of people saying this, or saying he took down the 5 families only for the Russians to move in. Yeah, that's what happens when you take down a dominant syndicate. If you take out a cartel, a mob, or a syndicate that dominates organized crime in an area, the rackets they run still exist and are profitable. Drugs are still going to be bought in that city. Fences are going to operate, pimps are going to work, hookers, etc. Because there is a market for those illegal things. So inevitably, another syndicate is going to try and take over. It's why taking out the Medellin cartel in Colombia started a war between the other cartels to take over their territory. Organized crime doesn't cease to exist because you put the biggest bosses away. It means new bosses struggle to take over their spots. If you put away all the Russian bosses today, someone else will take over in a few years. He also passed a bill as mayor that allowed cops to search someone's person without a warrant. Story 2. Blizzard Entertainment. So many good answers here, but goddamn, this one hits home. I guess it's because this one affects me personally. I thought I would play every Blizzard game out. I haven't played Overwatch 1.5 and Diablo 4. Diablo 4 hurts me the most. First Diablo ever. I fell in love with the game and the concept of a well-done dungeon crawler looter. No-lifed it until I hit the end game, and now it's just so goddamn stale. There was genuinely nothing left to do besides scour PvP zones for players who were at level 100 doing the same to my level 80 ass, and hunt dungeons for minuscule differences in my already OP gear. In a few months, I went from a game that I was physically experiencing reactions of excitement on my way home from work most days to the same no fun. No challenge left when I headed out halfway through Season 1. I'm sure you've heard it a million times. Path of Exile is the game for endgame loot explosions. It is constantly changing and updating, and while not every league is great, the game overall has been and continues to be an experience that is worth checking out every new season. If Path of Exile is too much for you, as it is for many people, there are plenty of other games in the ARPG space that aren't crap the way D4 is. Literally, Diablo 2 is the old king and still going strong. They have new seasons regularly, and while the game doesn't get completely changed over and over, if you haven't played it, it's worth a playthrough just so that you can see where ARPGs came from and how every single one of them is still trying to be Diablo 2 in some sense. D3, while a clear step down from Diablo 2, is still much better than D4 in my opinion. D3 doesn't have long-term staying power and tends to get stale after 2 to 3 weeks, but I regularly used to check out D3 every new season and jump in for a few weeks until the grind got boring. Sadly, Blizzard has all but given up on D3, so there might not be much to expect moving forward. The Last Epic is in early access on Steam and will be released literally next month. This game is designed from the ground up to basically be a more accessible version of Path of Exile. It still needs some polish, but in the current state it is in, I would call it 100 times better than D4, and I am personally excited to see how this game develops over the next year specifically. And finally, Path of Exile 2 is coming out later this year. This is supposed to pick up the mantle from Path of Exile and eventually replace it, but the company that runs it announced last year that they're going to keep both games going in parallel at least for a few years, because they like that Path of Exile is a matured game with 10,000 mechanics and is way overwhelming, and they want to give Path of Exile 2 its space to start slow and simple and grow into a complex monster in its own right in its own time, which is a great decision in my opinion. Don't let Diablo 4 discourage you. There are plenty of other good games in the genre, and I still have a flicker of hope somewhere that D4 will be worth playing in a year or two from now. Though I'm not wasting any time checking out any of the leagues as they come out right now. They aren't even addressing the fundamental problems that the game has with just being not very fun to play in general and extreme lack of endgame. I don't know, I remember how much of a Blizzard fanboy I was because every game was gold. Warcraft 1 was absolutely amazing, note for its time. Warcraft 2 was better somehow, and StarCraft left it in the dust. An entire game genre was created from a use map settings game in Warcraft 3. Dota spawned every MOBA game out there. I spent countless hours on Diablo 1 and 2, did the whole World of Warcraft thing. StarCraft 2 was great. There were some sketchy things on the horizon though. Paying full price for expansion packs wasn't ideal, but meh. Diablo 3 was a pretty good game as well, but that's when they started to nickel and dime crap. Added skins and DLC for StarCraft 2, auction house BS in D3, and things just went downhill. It's basically a parody of itself now, a massive corporation that gutted one of the best gaming companies ever and is now wearing the skin of Blizzard as some sort of macabre disguise. It's sad. Story 3. Fred Phelps of the Westboro Baptist Church spent much of the 60s and 70s as a prominent civil rights lawyer. Before he died, apparently he visited the gay commune, which has been built opposite the Westboro Baptist Church, telling them, "You know, you're not such bad people." Rumor has it, this is one of the reasons the rest of the family excommunicated him. Maybe he was trying to reconcile with God before his inevitable death, but I doubt it. Fred Phelps was always a legal troll, goading people into censoring WBC or denying picketing so that they could then sue for lots of money, which they did several times, and it was very lucrative. Important to repeat this, he wasn't fighting civil rights cases because he thought they were just causes. He was fighting these cases because they were flagrant violations of federal law by local governments, and so they were easy money in federal court. Yep, if you read some of the stories from his family, he was just a grifter who found a new grift. If it wasn't that, it would have been trying to force his kids to get famous somehow, or making them step in front of buses for the insurance money. His daughter's oral argument at the Supreme Court was one of the finest presentations on the First Amendment you can listen to. You can hate the church, but the lawyers in the family know their stuff. Story 4. OJ Simpson. Had he not murdered his ex-wife and her boyfriend, he would have likely remained among football's greatest. He may have eventually bought a team and other companies as many other football players do, and his acting career probably would have amounted to something bigger too. Well, unfortunately, he couldn't do that. Now whenever anyone says his name, it goes straight to the murders. It doesn't matter that he was acquitted. Everyone knows he did it, and his career and glory days are forever gone. Rewatching the Naked Gun movies is weird, seeing him as an actor doing slapstick comedy and not the murderer he is seen as today. Watch him closely in those movies. He blends right in with the likes of Leslie Nielsen and George Kennedy. He was a natural physical comedian and instinctively understood comedic timing. He could even be very expressive with his face and body language. Watch the scene when he is offered cupcakes. He had a real future in film, if not for the whole stabby thing. I disagree with him remaining a hero. Even if he didn't murder her and she was still alive today, we definitely still would have found out how much of a piece of crap he is. Have you heard the 911 recordings? It makes my stomach churn. We have multiple memoirs talking about how abusive he was. She had a restraining order against him, and he still stalked her. Cops refused to do anything about him because of his celebrity. The whole event is sickening, and she would be alive today if anyone took the danger he represented towards her seriously. Oh, and a fun fact. The guy, Ron Goldman, wasn't even dating Nicole Brown Simpson. He was there to deliver glasses left behind at a restaurant by mistake. I actually read the book the FX series was based on. Surprised to learn Ron Goldman wasn't her boyfriend, barely a casual acquaintance. He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. They were sorta becoming friends. They'd known each other for 6 weeks and had gotten coffee and a few dinners together, but it looked like everything was platonic. But he was definitely in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nicole had called up the restaurant Ron worked at to say her mother had left her glasses there. Ron wasn't even her server, but he agreed to drop off the glasses at her place later that night. After he clocked out, he spent 15 minutes drinking water at the bar, stopped at his place first, then walked 10 minutes to Nicole's to drop off the glasses. The prosecutor's timeline had Ron showing up pretty much in the middle of the murder. If Nicole's mom hadn't left her glasses, or maybe even if Ron had left earlier and not stopped at his apartment, he probably wouldn't have been killed. Depending on the timing of when he got to Nicole's, there was a non-zero chance that OJ might not have done the murders at all, at least not that night. It's a very real case where a few minutes difference could have really changed things. Story 5. Philipe Petain. He went from one of France's most respected generals in World War I to the head of the Nazi collaborating Vichy regime. What's particularly unique about him is how old he was when all of this happened. Up to the age of 58, he was just some random colonel nobody had heard of. He was nearly 60 when Verdun happened. Only then did he become a respected general and a war hero. His reputation kept growing after World War I and only reached its peak when he was well into his 70s. When he became a Nazi collaborating dictator in 1940, he was already 84 years old. By the time the Nazi regime fell, he had just turned 89. He died at the age of 95 after a couple of years of imprisonment. Petain didn't support Nazi ideology and was just a tired-old man who fought nobly in World War I and knew France wasn't prepared or capable to defeat the Germans in World War II. His delusion was that Vichy France would retain more autonomy than more sober minds expected. Petain was a symbol of a frightened, shattered, technologically insufficient nation against a military juggernaut with a bone to pick over the humiliation and poverty enacted by the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. He was a sad old man who let his image be used because he personally had no better moves at the time and hoped it would spare France's lives. France was emotionally destroyed after the losses of the previous generation. Germany was highly motivated for revenge. Petain was an appropriate symbol of a pre-defeated nation desperate to not fight. He's pitiable and the position was pathetic, but very understandable in context. This is why few, if any, World War II scholars group him in with the villains. Story 6. Elon Musk was well liked for a while, went from futuristic tech messiah to alt-right edgelord and Twitter addict in like 2 months. What I will never understand is his lack of self-awareness. He is a middle-aged man acting like an annoying 11-year-old and he thinks he is so cool and smart, exactly in the way an annoying 11-year-old would. But for an actual 11-year-old, it's forgivable and a part of growing up. Part of trying to be this person, finding yourself, failing and trying again. You know, your teenage years. As an adult, it's so clear when you see a kid act like that. How the hell does Elon not see how pathetic he is acting? Is he blinded by trying to compensate for the fact that he wasn't cool as a kid, so he just acts like what he thought made a kid cool when he was young, unaware of how extremely sad that is as an adult? I've got a theory that for attention-seeking personalities, they eventually realize that the quality of the attention doesn't matter. They start out getting a high from everyone loving them, but eventually they realize they get just as much out of knowing folks are thinking about them at all. And getting people to tell them to F off is much easier than getting them to like you. They're the human equivalent of rage bait. They're just after your engagement. I was so excited about SpaceX launches and watched so many of them live. I had a huge framed picture of the first Falcon Heavy launch hung in my office, had planned to buy a Tesla as my next car as well. Now, I still think space is cool, but I'm not even considering a Tesla and have deleted Twitter forever. He set himself up to be the next Thomas Edison. His companies were revolutionary and he had great aspirations. He even said he was doing all of this to fund his dream to live on Mars. Then he goes and pisses away $40 billion on Twitter and goes off the right-wing deep end. What a disappointment. Story 7. Let's not forget that George W. Bush had a 91% approval after 9/11, and in the early stages most people supported the war in Iraq. Also, Ellen was respected as an ideal feminist icon, but it turned out she was cruel and vindictive to those under her. Yes, because he lied and told Americans Iraq was the issue, and had WMDs. He appealed to emotion tugging at the heartstrings, and years later people realized he was full of crap, and that resulted in the death of many innocent lives. That wasn't why he had 91%, that all came later. He had a 91% approval rating because he gave a great speech from ground zero and threw the best first pitch of all time in Yankee Stadium. Basically, everything he did for the next couple of months looked and sounded great and gave everyone confidence in the president to guide the nation through the tragedy. Then the real work started, and it was not so great. I think he had a 91% because he happened to be POTUS during 9/11, and we all felt the need to rally behind the president. His speech was fine, but it was pretty much the speech any president would have given. It was pretty amazing watching how quickly he squandered all that goodwill, and even more amazing watching the Dems completely flub the opportunity. Story 8. Bill Cosby. Most people on Reddit know Cosby from The Cosby Show, but Cosby's career started in the 60s. The The guy was huge. Movies, music, TV, and comedy shows, plus a dozen albums, even a Motown record. He also produced and voiced a cartoon for most of the 1970s. People don't like to put him on the same level as Pryor, but he was just as big, if not bigger, than Richard Pryor. The guy could have had any woman he wanted voluntarily, but he threw it all away. Yeah, the We Need to Talk About Cosby documentary masterfully illustrates this. Testimonials from his victims going back to the 1960s are interspersed with the progress of his career, and it becomes clear that Cosby weaponized his public image against his victims. So many of the women interviewed, even as they describe an incredibly messed up story of assault, say things like, "But I thought I must have misunderstood what happened." Bill Cosby would never do something like that, would he? Like, even the actual victims struggled to get their heads around the dissonance of it. It's also an interesting exploration of separating the art from the artist. In this particular case, I came away from the documentary feeling as if Cosby's art was almost an accomplice to his crimes. But doesn't the whole concept of live long enough to become the villain mean that you were originally a good person and then becoming a hero comes with such responsibilities and pressures or power that it corrupts you or causes bad things to happen that change you into a bad person? Bill Cosby was always a creepy rapist deep down. His power/success just made it easier to get away with it. I think he would have been that kind of villain no matter what his career became. His history is so extensive, it's obvious he's always been a creepy guy through and through. Story 9. The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed won a Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago for his stated intent to bring peaceful harmony and cooperation to Ethiopia's various ethnicities. He then presided over one of the 21st century's most bloody conflicts, the Tigray War, and has recently been saber-rattling against Ethiopia's coastal neighbors to try to bully them into giving Ethiopia a port on the Red Sea. Recently, he has signed an agreement with the Somali breakaway state of Somaliland to secure a Red Sea port, which has sparked a vehement protest by the main Somali government. What makes this whole situation even more absurd is that the conflict was sparked specifically by Ahmed's peaceful intentions. The first thing he did was make an agreement with Eritrea to withdraw his troops from territory internationally recognized as Eritrean. This, however, made the Tigray people very, very mad as they wanted that land and were willing to fight both Eritrea and their own government to get it. And then, after that war, Ahmed comes to an agreement with the Tigray people that they'll stand down, but they won't be disarmed. Eritrea is now very, very mad that the people they just fought can technically still fight, and they start funneling weapons to other ethnic militias in Ethiopia that aren't on board with the whole peace, harmony, and cooperation deal. On top of this whole mess, Ethiopia really needs better port access because they're the most populated landlocked country in the world and are heavily dependent on foreign trade. Not everything can come through in Djibouti. Eritrea is actively hostile to them, and Somalia is a chaotic mess. Somaliland is basically the only choice they have if they want to get better port access peacefully. Aung San Suu Kyi also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. It's almost like Nobel Peace Prizes shouldn't be given out until after the people that did so much for peace have died to ensure that they don't do a 180 on it and become a massive witch after they've won the award and oversee the slaughter of innocent people, or become cruel and horrible dictators once they get a bit of power. Story 10. Robert Mugabe. Seen as a hero against the British colonial powers and fought to remove them, and then things took a very significant turn. So true. I was active in the anti-apartheid movement in the 70s, and Mugabe was our leader of choice. Now that looks like a terrible mistake, and even Zapu would have been better. It is the most guilty hindsight of my political life. A big factor is that the people who win revolutions are rarely the best people for after the revolution. So you have people who fight and die, and then when the war is over, you'd need to say to them, okay, now you suck at making decisions which will lead to your kids having a safe 9-to-5 job and a happy life. So we need to pick other people ahead of you. The problem is it became like those rules where a veteran gets a chance before a person who spent those years going to university. Yeah, it looks and feels better, but there is a risk you'll have someone who doesn't know how to run a chlorine system with your water. It's not just about it looking and feeling better, it's also a matter of how the F do you get rid of him if he doesn't want to leave. By nature of having won the revolution, he's going to be the de facto greatest military force in the country. If there was someone else you could ask to unseat him, then it makes you wonder why you couldn't ask them to get rid of the old dictator, and secondly, even if there is someone that can, now that you have your gorilla that thrives on snake meat, how do you get rid of them? Essentially, unless the revolutionaries are going to fight like hell for the country and then willingly choose to peacefully step down, then a revolution will typically just turn into another dictatorship. This is a major reason why Washington was very respected. A modern Cincinnatus was the way he has been described. People forget he wasn't just a general. He was one of the richest and most powerful people in the country to begin with. The founding fathers were basically the rich elites of the country, who had all developed, for the time, ultra-liberal extremist ideas. Even the people who really helped the revolution were a bunch of very unusual people. Von Steuben was gay as the day is long. Lafayette got the job basically because he was a Mason and so rich he worked for no pay. This phenomenon is also why militaries of one-man dictatorships are often awful at fighting, because a military that can fight a war is often the same one that can do a coup. So the focus is on loyalty and not on being good at fighting. On top of the corruption that always follows cronyism, as well as cultural issues as per that famous essay about Arab armies' fighting ability, involves the difficulty for a person from a modern Western nation-state that has at least a self-perception about meritocracy and it coming up against extreme tribalism and classism. Story 11. Had Mao died in 1956, his achievements would have been immortal. Had he died in 1966, he would still have been a great man but flawed. But he died in 1976. Alas, what can one say? Exactly. The same thing I thought of. Ended the decades of instability in China and subsequently brought about 2 decades of famine, murder, and chaos. China only became a developed country when he finally kicked it, and Deng and Zhao brought in reforms that pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty. Millions were already executed starting in 1950. He himself already claimed 700,000 dead in 1950 through 1952. He also created the People's Volunteer Army to have a technicality that the PLA wasn't officially involved in the Korean War. Such achievements would indeed make him immortal, I guess. I'm in China now, and the overwhelming opinion here is that he was a great leader. As for outside of China, it honestly wouldn't have made any difference if he died in 1956 or when he did. The main difference is that if he had died in 1956, most of us wouldn't have heard of him, because he would still be viewed negatively because he would be seen as the one who turned China communist. In the same way Lenin is negatively viewed. Lenin is viewed negatively because he is a psychopath who has no qualms about extreme violence, genocide, and the annihilation of personal rights, if it means getting his way. Also, I spent most of 2019 in China, and I heard much more mixed reviews on Mao. Although they were admittedly subdued, he made mistakes, etc. Probably has something to do with the party still maintaining its image. His face is on RMB and all. Story 12. Jimmy Savile, died a hero, was a pedophile. He was doing way more than that, sneaking into hospitals, screwing corpses, old dementia patients, stealing body parts and wearing them as jewelry on TV, like a whole spectrum of super messed up stuff most people can't even imagine. I watched the Louis Theroux program with him a few years ago, and knowing what we know now, it's incredibly upsetting. He got away with it because of how much charity work he was doing, and because he was thought of as a bit eccentric. When he died, people queued up in Leeds to pay respects to his coffin. It was a bit surreal even then. When all of this came out, the funeral directors who'd buried him waited at the cemetery until it got dark before removing his headstone because they knew it would get vandalized. His grave is officially unmarked, but apparently you can tell where it is because of all the dead grass and smell of urine. Story 13. Mr. Anime. He was one of the first anime YouTubers and was pretty popular during the time. Then he murdered his entire family and was intercepted by police before he reached the school that he was going to shoot up. Oh, a YouTube star. He must have sold out or took money for good review. What the F? He's an old YouTube star. This was back when Angry Video Game Nerd and the Nostalgia Critic were first starting out around this time. God bless the Angry Video Game Nerd. Thanks for reminding me he existed. I'm gonna go binge watch his videos now. Story 14. Kevin Spacey. Watching some of his old movies is so uncomfortable now. Such a shame, too. He was in some excellent films. K-Pax, Seven, Usual Suspects, American Beauty. The man was good. Real pity, he wasn't good. Not sure if this will be controversial or not, but isn't it fine to enjoy his performances and not see it as an endorsement of his actions off-screen? Hollywood chews through actors like popcorn, same as sports going through players. Some are remembered for the rest of time, but plenty aren't. I don't have a problem with watching people on the screen and applauding the performance alone. Then again, I guess there's a capitalist aspect, i.e. if Spacey was in a brand new movie, should we be giving him cash? There is a lot of debate about this in regard to these kinds of allegations, and it's been a hot topic this week with the reboot of Roseanne. A lot of people, myself included, feel as though there's enough good art out there by good people that I can enjoy. So if I can choose to support artists I agree with, why not do that? Not everyone chooses to boycott artists and companies they disagree with, and sometimes it's not always possible. For example, I try not to shop at Walmart because I don't like their labor practices, but I also have alternative options available that I can afford. Not everyone who shares my values can opt out of shopping there. Personally, I try to be understanding of my friends who eat at Chick-fil-A and watch Roseanne, but I do notice when my friends draw the line and when they don't in regard to what they choose to consume. I mean, you can't even listen to classic rock music if you don't separate the artist from the art. Bowie, Zeppelin, Eagles, and Stones, they all screwed underage groupies, some egregiously so. Besides, it's been argued since ancient times that art should be and is separated from its creator. Its true power lies in the receiver and the reaction it elicits from the receiver, not the artist itself. Poems are an extreme example of this, where poets are usually not even the best interpreter of their own work. Story 15. General MacArthur, World War II commander of American forces in the Pacific. When the Korean War started, his idea was to nuke the entire North. He was honorably relieved of his services. A quote attributed to Truman in the December 1973 issue of Time magazine on why MacArthur was fired. "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb SOB, although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail." Oh, he showed his true colors before Korea. The Bonus Army was the name for an assemblage of some 43,000 marchers, 17,000 U.S. World War I veterans, their families, and affiliated groups who gathered in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1932 to demand cash payment redemption of their service certificates. At 4:45 p.m., commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, the 12th Infantry Regiment, Fort Howard, Maryland, and the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, supported by 6 M1917 light tanks commanded by Major George S. Patton, formed on Pennsylvania Avenue while thousands of civil service employees left work to line the street and watch. The bonus marchers, believing the troops were marching in their honor, cheered the troops until Patton ordered, citation needed, the cavalry to charge them. Hoover ordered the assault to stop. MacArthur chose to ignore the president and ordered a new attack, claiming that the bonus march was an attempt to overthrow the U.S. government. 55 veterans were injured and 135 arrested. 14, a veteran's wife, miscarried. When 12-week-old Bernard Myers died in the hospital after being caught in the tear gas attack, a government investigation reported he died of enteritis, and a hospital spokesman said the tear gas didn't do. Story 16. OJ Simpson. Saw a documentary about his life. He was a terrible person from the start. He went after and took his friend's girl, got married and cheated on his wife and divorced her to marry the woman he cheated with. He didn't give a crap about the plight of African Americans and all the bad things that were happening to them in their fight for equality during the civil rights era. Yeah, if this dude was ever anyone's hero, then they need to reevaluate what they consider a hero. Being talented and working at a sport that benefits you is not heroic. It's just a lucrative thing to do if you can do it. There are plenty of athletes who actually try to help their or other communities, along with being great at what they do. I think we should be idolizing people like that. Story 17. Maximilien Robespierre helped start a revolution in France. There have been revolutions in history that I disagree with, but I think this one was pretty necessary. However, the reign of terror afterwards was not as necessary. He was pretty much the head of the Reign of Terror, and he did some really bad things. Sadly, living long enough was only a couple of years. He almost certainly had a mental breakdown. During the height of the madness in France, he just vanished into his bedroom for 3 to 4 months and then came out with a taste for blood. The funny thing is, the terror actually worked. If he was sound enough of mind to say, "This worked, let's go back to making democracy," he'd likely be lauded as somebody who took a brutal but maybe necessary decision to save France, as it was assaulted from within and without simultaneously. It is the fact he was paranoid and kept the terror going long after everyone had quieted down and was ready to back him that became a problem, even having Danton executed as a traitor to the revolution. The brutal repression of rebellion was nothing special. Russia did it in Poland about the same time. In fact, Russia killed more Poles in one night than died in the entire Reign of Terror. It was when he started killing his own, killing arbitrarily, etc., that it became a problem. The thing with Robespierre is that his reign was so short, and he only presided over the most turbulent period of the revolution. It's possible that in calmer times, he would have been a far better leader. They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I believe Robespierre exemplifies this. I don't subscribe to the myth that he was a power-hungry zealot. This was a guy who devoted his career to defending the poor and protecting the revolution. Besides, there were far more radical members in the committee, and Robespierre, being the most notable name, was scapegoated for the collective atrocities of the Jacobins. Story 18. I'm surprised nobody has mentioned Napoleon Bonaparte. The man gained fame through command of revolutionary troops during the French Revolution. He was a sort of Che Guevara of his time. He was essential to the deposition of the French monarchy and the establishment of France as a republic. He was so honored among European scholars that Beethoven reportedly was inspired by Napoleon to write his Third Symphony, Eroica, and initially dedicated that symphony to Napoleon, the dedication to be later retracted. All of that changed, though, when he declared himself Emperor of France and Europe at large. He had rescinded some of the progressive laws established during the revolution and was ultimately exiled to a remote island. He did return to claim his position and was in fact able to gain the support of the troops he once led, but this was short-lived and he was again exiled. The man went full tyrant with his power. He became what he was fighting against. I think that beauty, or villainy, is truly in the eye of the beholder with regard to Napoleon, more than with perhaps any other historical figure. There's no doubt he was a conqueror, but he brought a quite literally revolutionary code of law to almost all of Europe, and had he somehow made a few more strategic decisions and managed to have a longer and more stabilized rule, I think he may well have been viewed incredibly favorably worldwide. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you'd like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.